Doris Angleton was born on April 11, 1951, and grew up in Lake Jackson, Texas. In 1973, she received her degree in speech therapy from the University of Texas at Austin. After graduation, Doris began working as a school teacher. She later changed careers to become a sales representative for a pharmaceutical company. In 1976, Doris met a man named William Beck. The couple married and settled near Clear Lake City, a suburb of Houston. A few years after that, when Doris was 28 years old, she was at a party and met a man named Robert Nicholas Angleton, who was called Bob. Bob was only a few years older than Doris, having been born in 1948. He came from a wealthy family. Bob graduated from college in New York City and worked briefly in his father's business. His father withdrew financial support after a series of arguments about a woman Bob was dating. Apparently, his father did not approve of his son's romantic choices. Bob opened a restaurant with his brother Roger, but the business failed. In the late 1970s, Bob and Roger moved to Houston, Texas. Bob sold used cars and Roger worked as a real estate agent. Going back to his relationship with Doris after meeting at that party, Doris and Bob felt a mutual attraction. They did not let the fact that they were both married to other people stand in their way. They divorced their respective spouses and married in 1982. In 1984, Doris gave birth to twins Nicole and Alessandra. In 1985, Bob was arrested for bookmaking, but was never convicted due to lack of evidence. Through this arrest experience, Bob became close to the Vice Squad officer who arrested him. He eventually became an unpaid informant for the police and provided information about his competitors. When the police arrested his competitors, he would take over their businesses. Bob was able to earn about $2 million a year doing this. He became the most influential bookie in the area, far ahead of the rest. When the police officer who had originally arrested Bob retired, he also took up bookmaking, believing that his experience as a police officer would make it so that he could never be caught. Bob ended up reporting him, and he was arrested. You could say that Bob got his revenge against that police officer. In January 1989, Bob hired his brother Roger to work in the bookmaking business. But Bob was dissatisfied with his brother's performance and fired Roger in August 1990. This led to a number of dramatic confrontations, including Roger's attempt to blackmail Bob. Perhaps Roger was jealous because Bob was incredibly successful. Bob and Doris lived in a $650,000 home in the prestigious River Oaks neighborhood of Houston. Bob owned a tennis club, a golf course, a beach house, and real estate in Colorado. He and his wife had a very comfortable lifestyle. The couple had everything they could want in terms of material possessions, but Doris was not happy emotionally. By 1996, Doris was complaining to her friends that there was no passion or intimacy in her marriage, and she was quite lonely. To connect with other people, Doris started chatting in a chat room for people over 40 on AOL. At the time, chat rooms were a relatively new invention. She used the nickname Doritos and was very popular in the chat room. Doris used a strategy that was familiar to her when she was unhappy in her marriage. She started cheating. She met a married man who lived in New Jersey. Doris was very unhappy with this undesirable status. She was also not happy that he was married. After meeting with her husband in Arizona and Texas, Doris decided it was time to end her marriage to Bob. She filed for divorce in February 1997, claiming 50% of the property she shared with her husband. Bob said he had $3 million in various bank safes around Houston. He told her he would give her half of it. Doris was convinced that Bob had more money than $3 million. To motivate him to offer her a better deal, she threatened to report her suspicions to the IRS. Despite this threat, from an external perspective, the divorce process seemed amicable. Bob even continued to live in the same house as Doris. The plan was for him to stay there until his daughters graduated that school year. On April 16, 1997, Doris and Bob were at a softball game with their daughters. Bob was the head coach of the team. He asked Doris to go home and pick up a baseball bat. Doris agreed and drove back to their shared house. Shortly after Doris entered through the side door of the house, she was shot 7 times in the head and 5 times in the body with a .22 caliber semi-automatic handgun. The attacker never had any physical contact with Doris other than the bullets. It appeared that Doris was completely caught off guard. Doris did not survive the attack. Meanwhile, Bob was still at the softball game with his daughters. When he noticed that Doris hadn't returned, he called and texted her, but to no avail. He picked up his daughters from the game and drove back to the house. When he arrived home, he found the side door open. Bob did not enter the house. Instead, he called 911. Police arrived, entered the house, and found Doris dead on the kitchen floor. Upon further investigation, police found that there were no signs of forced entry and that the security system had been deactivated. It had been turned on when they left the house. They found a small safe in one of the rooms. The door was open and there were wads of cash inside. It seemed that the intruder was not interested in taking anything. The police asked Bob who he thought might be responsible for the murder. After asking the police to turn off the audio recorder they were using, Bob told them it might be related to his illegal betting business. Bob also blamed his brother Roger. He told the police how he had fired Roger years earlier and about all the drama that followed. For example, in January 1997, Roger wrote Bob a threatening letter. The police began to treat Roger as a suspect. They found out that he was supposed to appear in court in California on the same day that Doris was killed, but he did not show up. On April 21st, 5 days after the murder, Roger arrived at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport with his luggage. He had 2 handguns in his luggage, .32 and .38 caliber. An X-ray technician discovered the guns during the screening, but Roger fled the airport before police could arrest him. Although the guns did not match the murder weapon, which was a .22 caliber pistol, police found something else in his luggage that linked Roger to the murder. There were handwritten notes containing information on how to kill Doris, including her schedule. Roger was arrested in a Las Vegas hotel after he provided police with a fake ID. He agreed to a search of his room. During the search, police found several key pieces of evidence: printed instructions on how to get into the Angleton family home, an audio cassette containing the voices of 2 men who were planning Doris's murder, $64,000 in cash. 2 of Bob's fingerprints were found on the money. It looked like Bob had paid Roger to kill Doris. Roger was arrested for the murder and transferred to a prison in Houston. He agreed to testify against his brother Bob, but he never had the chance to do so. On February 7th, 1998, 2 days before the plea agreement was to become official, Roger used a disposable razor to cut himself more than 50 times. He did not survive this suicide attempt. Roger left a suicide note in which he confessed to the murder and stated that his brother was not involved. Roger wrote that he tried to blame his brother, but Bob was innocent. This unexpected statement added a new twist to the investigation and cast doubt on the investigators' previous assumptions. Despite Roger's note proclaiming his brother's innocence, Bob Angleton was charged with murder. The prosecution knew that one male voice on the audio tape belonged to Roger, and they believed that the other voice belonged to Bob. It appeared that Roger had recorded his brother planning part of the murder, such as talking about how to deactivate the security system. The problem for the prosecution was that Bob's daughters testified that the second male voice did not belong to their father. In addition, the voice expert was 80% certain that the voice did not belong to Bob. This testimony created significant difficulties for the prosecution in trying to prove Bob's guilt. On August 12, 1998, 15 months after his wife's murder, Bob Angleton stood before a packed courtroom in Houston. Prosecutors insisted that the only person in the world who had a motive to shoot Doris was her husband. They argued that his older brother Roger had done him a favor by allowing Bob to avoid the divorce process initiated by his wife without going to court or the tax authorities. Despite the fact that their own experts were 80% sure that the voice on the tape did not belong to Bob, the prosecution took a chance and presented the audio recording as evidence. On the recording, the interlocutors discussed how to stage the attack on Doris as a robbery. Roger even asked if he needed to remove the ring from the woman's finger, to which his interlocutor replied that there was no need to cut the finger. The prosecution argued that only a person who had some kind of relationship with the victim during her lifetime could say such a thing. In another part of the recording, the men discussed what to do with the family dog, and it was decided to lock it in one of the bathrooms. The defense insisted that this conversation took place between Roger and the hired killer, whom he hired of his own free will, but this claim seemed unlikely. It was unlikely that any hired killer would care about a dog. But for Bob, who loved his dog, it would have mattered if his pet had been harmed. On the last day of the trial, the defense team finally fought back, calling the 14-year-old Angleton twins as witnesses. Both girls confirmed that the voice on the tape did not belong to their father. Their testimony could be understood from an emotional point of view. Having lost their mother instantly, they could not lose their second father. After 8 days of testimony, the jury began deliberating, trying to reach an agreement. It seemed that at first they supported the prosecution's case, and prosecutors were looking forward to their verdict. But when the jury announced its decision, everyone was shocked. The verdict stated that Robert Angleton was found not guilty. Bob Angleton's not guilty verdict shocked the entire community. It seemed that the crime was quite obvious, and there was little doubt as to who was responsible for Doris's death. However, Bob was acquitted. 2 months after the trial, Angleton agreed to pay the IRS $1,700,000. However, the FBI was not done with him yet. They continued to follow him, hoping that he would slip up and return to bookmaking. The FBI launched a full-scale investigation into Bob's betting activities. Federal prosecutors believed that the key to Robert's acquittal was the poor quality and mishandling of Roger's recording. In the conversation presented in court, it was impossible to make out a single word. This time, FBI experts began to study the tape. They digitized the recording and were able to significantly improve its quality. Vanessa Leggett, a journalist and investigator who had interviewed every witness in the case and had audio recordings of these conversations, was subpoenaed. Agents wanted to get what she knew, hoping to find some additional clues. But Leggett refused to cooperate. Vanessa claimed that she had journalistic privileges and should not disclose her sources or turn over the recordings. She justified her position by saying that she could not let down the people who had trusted her. Leggett was charged with contempt of court and sent to prison. It is ironic that while Leggett was in federal prison, Robert Angleton was walking the streets of Houston freely. After 6 months, Leggett was released because federal prosecutors decided to continue the investigation without her help. Instead, they arrested Robert Angleton on federal charges of conspiracy to commit a murder for hire and unlawful possession of a firearm. The reason they were able to use this was because Robert had transported Roger across state lines from San Diego to commit the crime for him. The trial was to begin in Houston. Robert refused bail and turned the federal case into an international drama. 6 years after Doris Angleton's murder, her husband Robert was due to appear in federal court. The hearing was scheduled for June 12th, but Robert did not show up. He somehow managed to escape. Robert's life on the run was short-lived. He was detained at the Amsterdam International Airport with a fake passport. The customs officer, who noticed the discrepancy in identification, decided to conduct a full inspection of the passenger's belongings. The search revealed $135,000 in cash and several other documents with different names. However, there was another obstacle to Robert's return to Houston. The Dutch government rejected the U.S. extradition request. The only way out was to abandon prosecution on more serious charges and charge him only with tax evasion, money laundering, and forgery. Robert's flight from justice ended in 2004 when the Dutch government finally agreed to conditional extradition. 3 months later, Robert pleaded guilty to the charges. His total sentence was 12 years and 3 months, and he was to be released in 2014. The agreement with the Netherlands allowed the feds to re-indict Robert for conspiracy to murder Doris as soon as he was released, and everyone expected that to happen. Angleton was released from prison in 2012. He did not wait for new charges and escaped again. Unfortunately, Robert was never brought to trial for organizing the crime against his wife. When investigators looked into Robert's motives, they found that he had much more to lose in the event of a divorce than anyone could have guessed. In February 1997, Doris initiated divorce proceedings, demanding 50% of all assets. Robert offered her half of his estimated wealth, $1,500,000. Doris suspected that this was not the full amount and wanted to proceed legally. She consulted with a lawyer who explained that the only way to do this was to file a tax return that would disclose all of Robert's income. If this happened, Robert could lose everything and, moreover, end up in prison because of his betting activities. The detectives assumed that, not wanting to part with his money, the man made a deal with his older brother. The plan was for Roger to do the dirty work and then disappear. Robert Angleton knew that the police would not rest until they uncovered the truth and found the person who shot Doris. He needed to provide himself with an ironclad alibi and provide them with a potential criminal to absolve himself of all responsibility. The essence of Roger's story, which he confided to journalist Vanessa Leggett, was that after signing a contract with his brother, according to which Robert was to pay him $1 million, he doubted that his brother would not deceive him. So he recorded a conversation with him on tape. He wanted to use these recordings as leverage in case Robert refused to pay him the agreed amount for the elimination of his wife. He knew his brother well and realized that he would do anything to avoid paying. The Angletons hoped that Roger would manage to change his identity and go underground. They were confident that the police would not be able to gather all the case materials together. On the evening of the softball game, Robert probably deliberately left the baseball bat in the backyard so that Doris, having entered the house through the front door, would walk down the hallway through the entire house. Roger showed up at his brother's house in advance, was able to disable the alarm, get inside, and just wait for the woman to come home and walk past him. When that happened, Roger shot Doris at close range, and when she fell, he simply unloaded both guns into her to deprive her of any chance of survival. Doris knew too much and was becoming a burden. The media exploded when suspicion fell on Robert Angleton. They almost immediately declared him the organizer of the crime against his wife when they learned that his older brother Roger had been arrested in Las Vegas. The situation was complicated by the fact that Roger was reluctant to discuss his actions with detectives. The only person he decided to confide in was reporter and investigator Vanessa Leggett, and that was only on the condition that she would keep his secrets until the end of the trial. The entire community was shocked when Robert Angleton was found not guilty of Doris's murder. It seemed that the crime was quite obvious, and there was little doubt as to who was responsible for Doris's death. However, Bob was acquitted. This decision caused a lot of discussion and controversy in the community. Even though Robert Angleton was acquitted of Doris's murder, many questions remained unanswered. Why did Roger record the conversation about planning the murder? If it was not Robert's voice on the recording, whose voice was it? Why did Roger commit suicide, leaving a note absolving his brother of responsibility? Furthermore, it remains a mystery why Robert fled when he was facing federal charges. If he was innocent of Doris's murder, why didn't he stay to defend himself in court? These and other questions continue to surround the Doris Angleton case, making it one of the most enigmatic and debated crime stories. In 2016, Anchorage, the largest city in Alaska with a population of about 300,000, faced a series of violent crimes that were later linked to a single serial killer. The city, which already had a relatively high crime rate compared to other U.S. cities, was thrown into a state of fear by a series of seemingly random murders. Anchorage, like many other cities in America, has been plagued by the opioid crisis, which has led to an increase in gang activity and drug-related crime. However, a series of murders that began in the summer of 2016 appeared to be unrelated to these common problems, but instead the result of a single criminal acting without an obvious motive. The series of murders began on July 3, 2016. At 7:40 a.m., a woman riding a bicycle called 911 to report the discovery of two bodies on the grass near the Ship Creek Trail. The victims were 20-year-old Brianna Foisey and 41-year-old Jason Netter. Brianna Foisey was born in 1996 into difficult family circumstances. At the age of 5, she was taken in by a foster family. Brianna was diagnosed with fetal alcohol syndrome, attachment disorder, and learning disabilities. Despite these problems, she was known as an energetic and outgoing girl who loved music, especially Broadway shows, and had a talent for singing. However, her developmental issues led her to make questionable friendships in her teens and eventually fall into a problematic cycle that led to substance abuse. Jason Netter was also homeless. He was known for his kindness, sense of humor, sociability, and willingness to help others. Jason had a deep love of nature and animals. Like Brianna, he struggled with substance abuse, which led to numerous legal problems. His unemployment made life difficult, making him unable to provide child support for his two daughters. Despite their age difference, Jason and Brianna became close friends. Netter, who had been homeless for a long time, became a protector for young Brianna, trying to protect her from various dangers. The police who arrived at the crime scene found that both victims had died of gunshot wounds to the chest and head. The absence of bullet casings at the crime scene led investigators to conclude that the killer had probably used a revolver. One bullet was found near the bodies, indicating that the shooter had missed with a single shot. Further analysis revealed that the weapon was a Colt Python 357 revolver, known for its trigger sensitivity and accuracy. The witness who reported the bodies told detectives about the strange encounter. During a morning bike ride across the bridge, a stranger calmly informed her of the presence of two dead people on the trail below, warning her to be careful before continuing on her way. This information led her to discover the bodies and subsequently call the emergency services. The behavior of the unidentified man aroused the detective's suspicions. His refusal to report the bodies himself, his lack of urgency or stress over the discovery, and his calm demeanor, as if he were warning of a minor inconvenience rather than a deadly tragedy, attracted the attention of the police. However, the witness was unable to provide a detailed description of the man, focusing more on the horrific scene in front of her than on the person who sent her there. Investigators reviewed video footage from surveillance cameras in a nearby industrial area. One of the recordings showed a man walking along a path shortly before the bodies were reported. However, his face was not visible as he was moving away from the camera. The video provided only a general idea of his appearance: blue pants or jeans, possibly a hoodie or hat, a jacket and a backpack. The only more or less noticeable feature was his height. Less than a month after the tragic discovery of the bodies of Jason Netter and Brianna Fozzie, a new incident occurred. On the morning of July 29, 2016, 21-year-old Trayvon Kendall Thompson, who was known to his family as Trey, was the victim of a seemingly similar act of violence. Trey was known for his intelligence, kindness, and willingness to help those in need, often bringing homeless people to his home for meals. On that fateful morning, he was biking to his Aunt S' house in East Anchorage to feed her dog in her absence. Tragically, he was almost at his destination when he was fatally shot by an unknown assailant. Officers responding to the scene found Trey S' body in the street with gunshot wounds to the head and torso. As in the previous case, no shell casings were found at the scene. A key element in this case was a surveillance camera that had a direct view of the place where Trey met his death. This camera, located on Trey S' Aunt S' property, captured the gruesome scene just a few meters from her door. Ironically, just a few weeks ago, Trey had repaired this same surveillance system that now captured his own fatal encounter. The video footage showed a man walking calmly down the street, suddenly raising his hand, pulling out a gun, and shooting Trayvon Kendall Thompson directly in the face. After Trey fell down, the attacker calmly walked over, put the gun in his pocket, took Trey's bike, and rode away. This incident had witnesses. Two teenage girls who had stayed up late were telling each other scary stories at the window of a neighboring house. At first, they were worried when they noticed a tall figure standing near a fire hydrant, which seemed out of place in the middle of the night. Then their attention was drawn to another figure down the street, Trey, just before the fatal shots were fired. After a brief distraction, they looked again and saw the tragic consequences. Trey was lying motionless on the ground, and the attacker was slowly fleeing on a bicycle, passing by their vantage point. These observant teenagers provided detectives with a detailed description of the shooter, an older man with wavy shoulder-length hair, wearing heavy boots, a cap and camouflage jacket, and particularly notable for his height. Careful analysis of the video footage allowed experts to estimate the shooter's height to be around 6 feet 2 inches, or even taller. Based on detailed descriptions from teenage witnesses, a composite sketch of the suspect was created and subsequently released to the public along with a photo of Thompson's stolen bicycle. Police urged the community to be vigilant and cautious. The link between Trey's murder and the previous Ship Creek trail killings was quickly established by investigators, further deepening the mystery as Trey, like Brianna and Jason, had no apparent enemies or known reasons to be targeted, suggesting the eerie possibility of random acts of violence. Forensic evidence conclusively linked the murders through the use of the same weapon, confirming the presence of a serial offender in Anchorage. Exactly 1 month after Trey's tragic death, Anchorage police received reports of another pair of murders in the same area. On the night of August 28, 2016, a woman walking through Moon Valley Park called 911 after discovering the body of a young man, later identified as 34-year-old Kevin Turner. Like Brianna and Jason, Kevin was homeless. Tragically, this young man was struggling with schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. He searched for a facility that specialized in mental health, but was unable to find one that met his needs. Now, his life was over. Kevin was found sitting on a picnic bench in a park, his head resting on the table, holding socks in his hands. His shoes were off and standing nearby, indicating that he may have been attacked while trying to put on his socks. He did not seem to notice his attacker, as there was no sign that he tried to defend himself from the shots. Authorities also found a second victim in the park, later identified as 25-year-old Bryant DeHassan, a local environmentalist. He was on a nighttime bike ride and was found not far from where Kevin Turner lay. Although there was no direct connection between the two, no bullet casings were found at the crime scene, as in previous cases. The bullets that took the lives of Bryant and Kevin were fired from the same weapon, a 6-shot Colt Python 357 revolver. Detectives quickly concluded that the same gunman was behind the attacks, bringing the total number of his victims to 5. After the third incident, Anchorage police issued a warning to residents about the presence of a serial offender on the loose, urging them to be cautious and avoid public parks and bike paths, especially at night. The attacker showed no specific preference or targeting of a particular demographic, making potentially anyone the next victim. The community was gripped by fear after the warning. Along with the warning, authorities announced a $10,000 reward for information leading to the arrest of the perpetrator. Despite numerous clues and leads, progress in the investigation has come to a standstill. About 200 people gathered at Valley of the Moon Park, feeling the weight of recent events. People expressed concerns about the safety of the city. The mayor of Anchorage and the police chief met with the community following demands from the area for increased security. The mayor stated that community policing was working, but that the police department, with 386 sworn officers, was too small. According to professional standards, there should ideally be about 450 officers. The police chief emphasized the importance of the community's help in the investigation. He urged people to report any suspicious incidents, even if they seem insignificant, as this information could be vital to solving the case. James Dale Ritchie was born on November 4, 1976 in Anchorage, Alaska. During his school years, he stood out not only for his height, but also for his exceptional intelligence. Ritchie excelled in sports, playing both football and basketball, showing the potential for a professional sports career, as did 2 of his teammates. His talent caught the attention of the West Virginia University football team, leading to his recruitment after graduation in 1994. However, Ritchie's life path deviated significantly from what his peers expected. He enrolled at the university for 1 semester before dropping out to pursue a completely different path. Upon returning to Anchorage, Ritchie's life began to decline. He became addicted to illegal drugs, engaged in theft, drug trafficking, and organizing dogfights. Ritchie was arrested several times, and in 2005 he was convicted of burglary and attempted burglary with cable ties and 2 guns. After serving a 2-year sentence, James returned to Anchorage, where he is believed to have obtained his Colt Python revolver. In 2013, Ritchie moved to his parents' home in the small town of Broadway, Virginia. Even his mother expressed fear of him, describing him as a potential danger. She was convinced that her son's fate was either life in prison or a violent death. Despite these ominous predictions, Ritchie seemed to be looking for a change. He began preparing for an associate's degree at a local college and attended classes. James was reportedly friendly with his neighbors, making friends and even experiencing love. Nevertheless, Ritchie's later choices led him to a grim series of violent crimes, culminating in his death during a confrontation with law enforcement. Ritchie seemed to be rebuilding his life, but this phase was short-lived. His romantic relationship ended in a way that was far from what he had hoped for, causing deep stress for both individuals involved. Struggling with his feelings, Ritchie returned to Anchorage in March 2016. He even sought mental health support and took antidepressants for a while. Law enforcement was unable to confirm whether Ritchie had been officially diagnosed with any psychiatric condition, but there are indications that he may have indeed suffered from schizophrenia. After his death, a former roommate said that James Dale Ritchie often made strange claims, such as that he had the power to change weather patterns, truly believing he could make it rain or shine. He also had beliefs about his ability to dictate life and death, choosing who would survive and who would die. The situation changed dramatically in November 2016, when a completely separate incident accidentally led investigators to the suspect. The way in which this breakthrough occurred was startling. In the early hours of November 12, 2016, around 4:30 a.m., Anchorage Police Department officer Arne Salau was patrolling downtown when he received a report of a crime in the area. A taxi driver reported a passenger who had evaded paying the fare and fled from his car. While near the scene, Salau decided to search the neighborhood for the fugitive. On the almost empty streets at dawn, he noticed a man walking along the sidewalk. Salau intended to ask if the man had noticed any unusual activity and called out to him from his car, demanding that he stop. However, the individual ignored Salau's command and continued on his way, which was recorded by the patrol car's dashcam. Despite repeated orders, the man did not stop. Salau then intensified his efforts, using the car's loudspeaker to issue a command. Eventually, the man turned and walked in the direction of Salau's car, but instead of talking, he suddenly attacked, pulling a gun from his clothing and opening fire on the officer. Salau got out of his car and engaged the officer, returning fire. Sergeant Mark Patsky, who was nearby, intervened to help his colleague, also shooting at the attacker. Officer Salau was shot 4 times, suffering significant bone, liver, and intestinal injuries from the shooting. Despite his critical injuries, Salau survived. He was quickly taken to the hospital where he underwent a critical 7-hour surgery. The attacker had suffered a fatal gunshot wound to the head and was pronounced dead on the spot. It was only after his death that detectives investigating a series of crimes in Anchorage in recent months were able to link the individual to the main suspect. They analyzed the video of the shootout from the police car's dashboard camera and compared it to footage from other cameras during previous events. The unidentified man fit the profile of a serial offender. He was wearing a cap with a visor and a camouflage jacket, was extremely tall, and fired using only one hand. In addition, there was another key piece of evidence. The weapon used by the attacker was confirmed to be a Colt Python .357 6-shot revolver, the same weapon linked to all 5 deadly incidents. The shooter was identified as James Dale Ritchie. After James Dale Ritchie's death, detectives still lacked concrete evidence to definitively link him to the crimes. The similarity of the physical description and the identical weapon used in all 5 cases provided strong grounds for suspicion. The challenge now was to gather additional evidence to provide new reassurance to the public. During a search of Ritchie's home, law enforcement found 18 shell casings hidden in his closet, which matched the number of bullets fired from the revolver in all 5 incidents. Ballistics analysis confirmed that the weapon belonging to Ritchie was responsible for the victims' deaths. This evidence was deemed sufficient to officially announce in April 2017 that James Dale Ritchie was the attacker responsible for the serial crimes that kept Anchorage in a shadow of terror for months. Unfortunately, this revelation was of little comfort to the victims' families, who would have preferred to see the perpetrator captured, tried, and sentenced to life in prison. The motives behind Ritchie's deadly actions against these 5 individuals remain unknown and are likely doomed to remain unsolved. An interesting detail that may or may not be relevant to the case is that in his youth, James was close to Trayvon Thompson's father, Bobby Thompson. This long-standing friendship continued, and at the time of his son Trey's murder, Bobby was in prison for illegal drug and firearms offenses. This element has sparked speculation as to whether Ritchie knew his target that fateful night, and whether the memory of his friend came to mind. The series of murders committed by James Dale Ritchie had a profound impact on the city of Anchorage. For several months in 2016, residents lived in an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty, not knowing who the next victim might be. These events highlighted safety concerns in the city and sparked discussions about the need for more police officers and improved public safety. While Ritchie's identification and death brought some relief to the community, it also left many unanswered questions. Richie's motives remain unclear, and we may never know why he chose these particular victims. The connection between Richie and the father of one of the victims adds another layer of complexity to this already confusing case. The case of James Dale Ritchie has also drawn attention to broader issues facing Anchorage. The city's high crime rate, drug and homelessness problems were highlighted by this series of murders. Many of Ritchie's victims were homeless or had drug problems, highlighting the vulnerability of these populations. The FBI's investigation into Ritchie's possible involvement in other unsolved murders in various U.S. states adds another dimension to the story. It raises questions about how many more crimes Ritchie may have committed and whether there were other victims elsewhere. Ritchie's accidental discovery during a routine police check also raises the question of how many more victims there might have been had he not been stopped. This underscores the importance of vigilance and effective law enforcement in preventing and solving such crimes. Despite the tragic nature of these events, they also demonstrated the strength of the Anchorage community. Residents came together to support each other and work with law enforcement to improve safety in the city. The case of James Dale Ritchie remains a reminder of the unpredictability and complexity of human nature, and the continued need for vigilance and cooperation to keep communities safe. Although many questions remain unanswered, the resolution of this series of murders has brought some closure to the victims' families and the people of Anchorage, allowing the city to begin the process of healing and recovery. The night of May 25, 1996, was hot and sweltering in the California town of San Luis Obispo. The Polytechnic University campus, nestled in the picturesque hills, exuded the smells of youth, recklessness, and hard liquor. The Pi Kappa Alpha fraternity rattled off a birthday party for one of its campus sisters. Among the guests was Christine Sandy Smart, a pretty blonde girl with mischievous blue eyes and a stubborn chin. In her 26 years, she has managed to gain popularity at uni, thanks to her job as a lifeguard at the recreation center and her friendly, cheerful disposition. On this May night, Christine came to the party alone, without a group of friends, which was atypical for this sociable and cheerful nature. In the spacious fraternity house, music was blaring, alcoholic drinks were flowing, creating a full atmosphere of reckless student fun. Christine was thrilled to be caught up in this whirlwind of dancing, loud conversations, unrestrained laughter, and flirting. The tight-fitting dress emphasized her slender figure, making her the object of close attention from her classmates. She lost count of the glasses she drank, surrendering to the euphoria and the feeling of celebration without limits. Toward 2 o'clock in the morning, the girl began to feel uneasy. She felt dizzy, her legs felt woozy, and the nauseating weight of overeating and overdrinking settled in her stomach. Christine decided she'd better go home to her cozy room in the Malou Towers dormitory. But going alone in such a drunken state was extremely risky at this late hour. Fortunately, on her way out of the frat house, she ran into some familiar faces, Cheryl Anderson and Tim Davis, her classmates. They were also quite tipsy but realized that Christine needed help right away. "Hey, can you guys walk me back to my dorm? I don't feel so good," she moaned, leaning her shoulder against the door jamb. Cheryl and Tim looked at each other, silently agreeing to help her to a safe place. Nearby, they spotted another student who was also at the party, Paul Flores. He was stocky, with short dark hair and a piercing, tenacious stare. Paul was also a little tipsy, but more or less on his feet. He gallantly offered to take Christine to her dormitory himself, for he lived very close by on the next block. Paul took the girl under his arm and led her slowly into the night, saying goodbye to Tim and Cheryl. They watched the silhouettes of their classmates walk away down the dark alley, perhaps seeing Christine alive for the last time. This scene seemed to warm the heart, a noble student helping his friend in her time of need. But no one suspected at the time that a blood-chilling tragedy would follow. The next morning, Christine never returned to her dorm room at Malou Towers. Her roommate, Margarita Campos, became seriously concerned. Christine's cell phone was unavailable. No one answered the loud knocks on the door from inside. And most importantly, all her belongings, including her passport, wallet, bank card, and documents, remained lying untouched at home. Margarita simply could not explain where her friend could easily go without the most basic things. The girl appealed to the police only 48 hours later, when Christine's absence began to feel just frightening. But law enforcement officers took the missing persons report very lightly and negligently. After all, the entire country had just celebrated Memorial Day, which honors American military personnel killed in wars. The cops assumed that the girl could just roll up for a couple days to her parents' house in another city, since it was a weekend. It was the first serious investigative error, opening a long line of omissions and criminal inaction. It was almost 4 days before Christine's parents in the distant town of Stockton received word of their daughter's disappearance. A worried Denise and Stan Smart immediately sounded the alarm at the local police, but even there they could not help them at first. Only then did the San Luis Obispo police begin to make some progress. They called in Paul Flores, the last person who reportedly saw Christine alive the night of her mysterious disappearance. The night of her mysterious disappearance. The 19-year-old student could not tell anything clear, only said that he allegedly accompanied the drunk girl to the entrance to the hostel Malu Towers, after which she went to her own place, and he went away. However, this version was severely broken by the testimony of the neighbors on the block of the same Paul Flores. They claimed that the guy returned home only around 5 a.m., that is, almost 3 hours after he allegedly escorted Christine to the door of the dorm and said goodbye to her. Such a big-time gap did not fit in the justification. But the most suspicious were the injuries on Paul Flores's face and legs. The guy confusingly explained their appearance, then a domestic quarrel with a neighbor, then a night street fight, then the consequences of a drunken fall somewhere. 3 different versions from one man in a short period of time. Detectives immediately smelled something wrong, but they had no direct evidence to make an arrest. At the time, cell phones didn't have geolocation tracking. Fingerprints and other traces in the dorms or on campus were not seized and preserved in time. Nor was a forensic and canine search of Paul Flores's home conducted. Days passed, turning into weeks, and the investigation into the disappearance of Christine Smart hopelessly stalled. The girl's parents hired a private detective and announced a reward for any clue, but it was not enough. A month after the disappearance, police were forced to expand the search to Christine's hometown of Stockton, 350 miles away. The local media picked up the story and began running it on the front page every day, drawing parallels to the cult TV series Twin Peaks about the FBI's investigation into the murder of a schoolgirl in a fictional town. Newspaper and TV journalists began to build the most incredible versions, supplementing them with the revelations of all kinds of psychics and soothsayers. It came to the point that one of the clairvoyants claimed that Christine Smart was murdered by 2 unknown men on the campus, after which her corpse was allegedly taken to a high cliff and thrown into the water to hide the traces of the crime. Such delusional testimony, of course, did not inspire confidence in professional investigators. They still clung to Paul Flores as the main and perhaps the only suspect. But the young man stubbornly refused to make contact, citing the Fifth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which allows a suspect not to testify against himself. A year after Christine's disappearance, her parents filed a civil suit against Paul Flores, accusing him of involvement in their daughter's disappearance. A protracted trial began in 1997. Paul was forced to testify under oath while exercising his Fifth Amendment right not to answer most key questions. Paul's parents then filed a countersuit against the Smart family, alleging moral turpitude. The litigation dragged on for many months and ultimately came to nothing. The police had no direct evidence of Flores's guilt, and he refused to cooperate with the investigation. On May 25, 2002, exactly 6 years after her disappearance, Christine Smart was officially declared dead by the court. Around the same time, rumors started circulating in the media that one Scott Peterson, a local pervert and serial killer who had served time for the massacre of another young woman, might be involved in her disappearance. This speculation was based only on the fact that as a student, Peterson had attended the same California Polytechnic University as Christine for a time. But after a brief investigation, police ruled out the jailbird's involvement in Smart's disappearance, and so flashed another 16 long years of utter hopelessness. During this time, there were several changes in the leadership of Christine's investigation team. Old employees retired, or were transferred to other departments, and evidence and investigative threads were irretrievably lost and misplaced. Until in 2018, a California resident named Chris Lambert decided to record a series of his own podcasts on various unsolved crimes and criminal mysteries. Chris was only 8 years old at the time of Christine Smart's disappearance in 1996, but he remembered the story well from daily media reports. So 22 years later, Lambert decided to conduct his own journalistic investigation into the details of that case. As he dived into the intricacies of the missing student's disappearance, Chris became horrified at how negligent and irresponsible law enforcement officers had been all these years. Lambert first decided to interview all available eyewitnesses and witnesses to the events of the May night in 1996. From students at California Polytechnic State University, he learned many forgotten and half-forgotten details. So, Paul Flores in those days had not the best reputation among his classmates. The guy was repeatedly accused of licentious behavior and obsessive solicitation of girls. Although no formal complaints were ever filed against Paul Flores, perhaps out of fear of retaliation or repercussions, Chris Lambert then analyzed all the actions of the investigators from the very beginning of the investigation and came to the conclusion that they made a number of critical errors and omissions. Detectives did not search Flores's home until 2 months after Christine Smart's disappearance, and at that point, 19-year-old Paul was still living with his parents, so police should have searched the home as one of the first emergency measures. But they didn't. And when the search did take place, it was conducted in an extremely shoddy and improper manner. The detectives did not involve either criminalists or experienced investigators, or even service dogs trained to pick up scent trails. Without this, the search was essentially a waste of time and resources. Another omission was the failure of the police to seize and inspect the family's 2 vehicles. In one of them, Paul Flores may well have driven Christine's body somewhere off campus if the murder theory is accepted. Subsequently, a few months after the cops' visit, one of the Flores' cars had been stolen, and the other had been trivially sold to new owners. But the most glaring omission Lambert considered the fact that the house of Paul Flores' mother, police, never visited with a search during the investigation. But there could have been some important evidence, traces, or clues. Moreover, Chris found out some truly sinister details about Paul's mother's house. It turns out that 4 months after Christine's disappearance, the house was rented by a woman named Mary Laysider, and in one of the rooms she found an earring, very similar to the jewelry that was on Christine on that fateful night of May 25, 1996. The same earrings were on a photograph of the missing girl that had been posted all over the campus at the time. Worried, Mary took the find to the police. And what do you think? At first, the cops refused to enter the earring as evidence in the disappearance case, and when they were forced to do so, they subsequently lost it. But Chris Lambert's shocking discoveries didn't stop there. It turned out that the entire backyard of Paul Flores's mother's house had always been perfectly poured concrete. However, around the same time that Christine went missing, some of the concrete was suddenly excavated, and an earthen flower bed appeared there. Mary Laysider, who subsequently rented the house, told Lambert a truly sinister detail. For several weeks, she had heard a sound very similar to the alarm of an old electronic wristwatch every day at 4:20 in the morning and at 4:20 in the afternoon. Moreover, the sound was coming directly from the ground of the very same flower bed in her backyard. One day, the annoying beeping finally stopped. Perhaps the batteries in some old watch had run out, or maybe it had simply been dug up and removed from the ground along with the source of the sound. Chris Lambert decided to go to Christine Smart's mother with this sinister clue. And when he told the woman the story of the alarm clock, she was petrified with shock and dropped the picture of her daughter from her hands. Denise Smart struggled to gather her thoughts and replied, "My Christine always set the reminder alarm for 4:20 a.m. She had to get up early to make it to work at the rec center at the university by 5 o'clock. When Chris Lambert's podcast with the results of his investigation went live in early 2019, the response was truly deafening. In a matter of weeks, the audio was listened to by more than 6 million people across the country. The public was shocked by the inaction and irresponsibility of the local police, who had allowed Christine Smart's killer to walk free all these years. The new leads and evidence uncovered by reporter Lambert only served to increase people's outrage. As a result, the San Luis Obispo County Sheriff's Department was forced to revisit the case after 23 years and launch a new full-scale investigation. It was only now that investigators did their job properly. A thorough search was conducted at 4 locations at once, including Flores's home. Authorities announced the discovery of some evidence of interest to the investigation. However, on January 29, 2020, more specifics became known. 2 vehicles belonging to Paul Flores were seized as potential exhibits in the reopened case. The most important accomplishment of the new investigative team was the excavation of the very sinister flower bed in the backyard of Paul Flores's mother's home. The old detectives in the 90s were incredibly negligent in missing this possible clue to the disappearance of Christine Smart. Unfortunately, no remains of the girl herself were found in the soil. However, the county prosecutor officially stated that there were clear signs of decomposed human flesh in the soil. This was becoming the strongest evidence against Paul Flores as the prime suspect. On February 11, 2021, Paul Flores was arrested by law enforcement. But the reason was not yet the murder charge against Christine Smart, but a violation of gun registration laws. During the search of Flores's home, an unregistered firearm rifle was found. On March 15, 2021, the court issued a search warrant for another house, this time belonging to Paul Flores's father named Ruben, and on April 13th of that year, both father and son were arrested at once in the case of Christine Smart's disappearance. In the court indictment, Paul Flores was charged with first-degree murder. According to the investigation, after that party 25 years ago, Paul was alone with Christine. There was a quarrel over rejected advances, which escalated into a violent fight, perhaps hence the injuries on Flores's body, evidence of the girl's desperate resistance. As a result, Paul probably inflicted fatal injuries on Christine. Afterwards, with the help of her father, they buried the corpse in the backyard of her mother's house. Sometime later, the body was apparently exhumed and moved to another as yet unknown location. That's where the alarm clock sound from underground at the mother's house came from. It was Christine Smart's own wristwatch. Ruben Flores was arrested on charges of aiding his son Paul in hiding the girl's body and destroying evidence. In September 2021, the Christine Smart murder case went to trial. Paul and Ruben Flores refused to plead guilty, because of which the process was greatly delayed. But the prosecution was confident in the presence of sufficient evidence for a conviction. Defense attorneys, on the other hand, insisted that all the items seized by the investigation were circumstantial evidence, and there was no direct evidence. Nevertheless, in October 2022, 26 years after Christine Smart's disappearance and a year of intense trial, the jury reached a verdict. They found Paul Flores guilty of aggravated first-degree murder. He now faces 25 years to life in prison. Final sentencing is set for December 2022. As for Paul's father, Ruben Flores, who was charged with aiding and abetting his son and covering up the crime, the jury did not find his guilt conclusively proven. However, the San Luis Obispo County prosecutor has assured that the investigation against Ruben will continue. The investigation intends to get a confession from him and find out where the remains of the unfortunate Christine Smart. The parents of the deceased girl, Denise and Stan Smart, met the jury's decision with relief, although they expressed regret that the body of their daughter has not been found in a quarter of a century. In an open letter, they thanked Chris Lambert and all the caring people who kept law enforcement from hushing up the case for years. The Smarts wrote that without the public's persistence, the perpetrators would have gone unpunished. The disappearance of Christine Smart has not only become one of the most high-profile and confusing cases in California history, it led to the introduction of an important bill into the state's higher education system. The law, called the Christine Smart Campus Safety Act, requires all public colleges and state-funded institutions to enter into agreements with local police departments to investigate student violence in a timely manner. The regulation was unanimously passed by the California legislature and signed into law by Governor Pete Wilson. Law enforcement officials will now be looking much more closely at missing students to prevent a tragedy like that of Christine Sandy Smart from happening again.
On a sunny January evening in 2004, the town of Sarasota, Florida, was filled with peace and grace. 11-year-old Carly Brucia was saying goodbye to her best friend after a day of fun. The girls had a great time playing and having fun, as kids their age usually do. However, no one even suspected that this carefree day would turn into a terrible tragedy. Usually, Carly's mother or stepfather would pick her up when she was visiting a friend. That day, however, her parents were very busy, so the girl decided to walk home on her own. The distance was short, and the sun was still shining outside, so it seemed like nothing bad could happen. Carly promised to be careful and not to wander, because she had an important soccer match on TV that she was going to watch with her family. Innocent and cheerful, Carly left her friend's house around 6:15 p.m. and headed down a narrow street lined with 1- and 2-story houses. However, when her friend's mother called Brucia's home, it turned out that no one had allowed the girl to go alone. The worried woman immediately asked her husband to drive the car and go to intercept her daughter. Carly's stepfather searched the entire neighborhood, driving repeatedly along the route the girl was supposed to take, but to no avail. Carly was nowhere to be seen. The frightened family began to call their daughter's friends, thinking that she might have visited one of them, but in vain. No one had seen the girl since the moment she said goodbye to her friend. Soon, around 7:30 p.m., when waiting made no sense anymore, the parents reported their 11-year-old daughter missing to the police. Law enforcement officers immediately pulled together all available forces to search for the girl. They interviewed passers-by, looked into basements and parks, and searched every suspicious building and nook and cranny. However, no trace of little Carly could be found. The search lasted all night with intense but futile work. The girl disappeared, as if she had vanished into thin air. The only clue was the testimony of her stepfather about a red truck that circled the area where Carly was last seen. With the first rays of the new day, a new phase of the search began. Investigators decided to review CCTV footage in the vicinity of the girl's route. Undoubtedly, small details could help to put together a picture of that ill-fated evening. And then, on one of the recordings from a large car wash, the detectives saw something terrible. The video clearly captured the moment when, at 18:21, a few minutes after Carly left her friend's house, the girl was walking along a regular path past the car wash. Suddenly, an unknown middle-aged man in work clothes approached her. He said something sharply to Carla, then roughly grabbed her arm and led her away from the camera. Investigators were shocked by what they saw. It seemed that the video captured the very moment of little Carly Brucia's abduction. The attacker was clearly acting boldly and decisively, and his movements showed that he was threatening the girl, possibly with a weapon, to obey and not to lag behind. The whole thing looked terrifying and reminiscent of the worst horror movie. In desperation, law enforcement officers made every effort to identify the perpetrator on the recording. Watching these inhuman images was heartbreaking, but they had to act quickly before it was too late to save the child's life. The first clue for investigators was a red pickup truck seen by Carly Brucia's stepfather near the girl's disappearance. Initially, suspicion fell on the owner of the vehicle, the stepfather of Carly's friend Ron. However, when the investigators interviewed the man, he provided a convincing alibi. Ron said that after Carly's mother became concerned about the situation, he decided to join the search for the missing child. Colleagues and acquaintances corroborated Ron's testimony, and investigators were forced to reject him as a suspect. Instead, the detectives focused all their attention on the person in the video, an unidentified man in work clothes with a patch that looked like a name. His behavior and bold actions immediately gave him away as a person with a criminal past and inclinations. Soon, one of his friends suggested that it could be 37-year-old Joseph Smith, a car mechanic with a rather impressive criminal record. As it turned out, Smith had a number of arrests for various offenses, ranging from possession of illegal substances to assault, kidnapping, and false imprisonment. At the time of Carly's alleged abduction, the man was on parole after one of his previous sentences. However, even the status of a parolee did not stop Smith from committing new crimes. He had already violated his parole twice, but somehow avoided returning to prison. Now law enforcement suspected that the incorrigible criminal was in serious trouble again. When Joseph Smith was summoned for questioning, he denied any involvement in the disappearance of Carly Brucia. The man claimed that he was in a completely different place that evening and could not have been near the car wash. However, some details of the man's appearance in the video suspiciously resembled Smith himself. Similar build, height, even the way he walked. Although Joseph claimed his innocence, investigators decided not to let him out of their sight. After all, who else could the kidnapping record relate to, if not a repeat offender with a penchant for violent crime? Consequently, the investigation focused on Joseph Smith and his possible involvement. At first, the case against Smith seemed somewhat unconvincing. First, the color and model of the car the man was driving did not appear to match the vehicle of a suspect named Joseph. However, the investigation soon uncovered compelling evidence of the man's alleged involvement. After thoroughly reviewing surveillance footage from the entire neighborhood, detectives saw a light-colored Buick enter the car wash only 3 minutes before Carly's abduction. The owner of this particular Buick turned out to be an elderly couple with whom Joseph Smith had rented a room. During the search of Smith's apartment, they found a number of his gray car mechanic work suits with a Joe patch, very similar to the clothes of the attacker in the video. In addition, several hairs matching the structure of the hair of the missing Carly Brucia were found on the Buick evidence vehicle. Despite all these suspicious coincidences, as well as the spoons found with the remains of illegal substances, Joseph Smith continued to insist on his innocence in the girl's abduction. However, his assurances lost their credibility when it turned out that the man had seen reports about Carly's disappearance on the news and had blatantly lied to investigators about his presence at home on the decisive evening of the tragedy. All the details of the suspicion against Smith gradually added up to a terrifying puzzle. Few doubted whether the hardened criminal was ready to admit his guilt in court. The chances of acquittal were becoming more and more illusory. Backed into a corner by undeniable evidence, Joseph Smith realized that he needed some way out of the situation. And then he had the idea to confess to his family, hoping for their understanding and mercy. The first people to whom Smith revealed the terrible truth were his brother John and his mother. Under pressure from his relatives, whom he was trying to comfort, the man finally confessed to all the details of the horrific kidnapping and murder of Carly Brucia. In a voice broken and trembling with the details of his own story, Joseph said that he had taken the girl by force to his car, where he committed the heinous crime of raping her and then allegedly strangling her. The perpetrator also pointed out the place where he hid the victim's body after the massacre. John remained silent before the investigators for several days, still hoping that his brother would turn out to be innocent. However, when he realized that the police could implicate him in the case and recognize him as an accomplice by omission, he decided to tell law enforcement everything Joseph had revealed to him. John took the investigators to the place where the dismembered remains of the unfortunate Carly lay under the branches of a small church a few hundred meters away. Apparently, in an attempt to hide the traces of the crime, Joseph tried to dismember the victim's body. At the trial, the evidence of Smith's guilt proved to be overwhelming and impressive. The video from the camera that recorded the child's abduction, the coincidence of evidence and findings from the suspect's car and apartment, and Joseph's DNA on the victim's body all created a complete and gruesome picture of the crime and its perpetrator. Despite his fierce attempts to deny the charges, Smith was sentenced to death due to the particular cruelty of his murder of a young child. It seemed that he would not be able to get any discounts or excuses. However, there was another unexpected twist in Joseph Smith's fate. In 2017, more than a decade after his conviction, the death penalty was suddenly canceled. The reason was a change in the law. Now a unanimous jury verdict was required to impose the death penalty. In Smith's case, the jury was not so unanimous in the need for his execution. 10 out of 12 were in favor of execution. At the same time, no one was going to release a long-term repeat killer so easily. Despite the reversal of the death sentence, Joseph Smith was left to serve life without parole. He seemed to be behind bars forever because of his heinous crime. However, Florida authorities decided to reinstate Smith's death sentence. In April 2020, the court reconsidered the possibility of execution and still returned this capital punishment. The murder of a young child was too grave and brutal to let the killer live. In the end, the long-awaited death sentence was never carried out. On July 26, 2021, at the age of 55, Joseph Smith died in the prison hospital of natural causes. His terminal illness outstripped the punishment of justice. Despite the fact that the proceedings in the case of the kidnapping and murder of Carly Brucia have been officially closed, the troublemaker Joseph Smith continues to haunt investigators. According to some indications, he may be involved in another unsolved murder of a teenage girl that occurred in 2000. Frankly speaking, even John's own brother suggested that that horrible case could also have been the work of this incorrigible criminal. Unfortunately, however, it proved impossible to find conclusive evidence of Smith's involvement in another murder. Investigators worked hard, but did not find a single key clue that would allow them to officially link Joseph to that old case. Therefore, there is a high probability that the 2000 murder will remain an unsolved police mystery for many years. The tragic story of Carly Brucia struck the hearts of many people with its cruelty and senselessness. The little girl's life ended so suddenly and horribly because of one single incorrigible criminal. However, the victims should never be forgotten, nor should those who sacrificed their lives to unravel this painful case and punish the offender. May the memory of Carla forever remain a bright spot in the darkness of human cruelty.